Here's something almost nobody tells you about narcissists in silence. It doesn't make them sad. It makes them unravel. Most people assume that when you go no contact with a narcissist, you're leaving them to grieve. You picture them missing you, thinking about you, maybe even growing as a person because you're gone. That's not what happens. What actually happens is closer to a system failure. You've pulled the plug on something they depended on without even realizing how much, and what's left behind isn't grief. It's a scramble. If you've ever wondered why your silence seemed to hit harder than any argument you ever had with them, stick around because we're going to walk through exactly what happens inside a narcissist's mind when no contact stretches on for weeks, months, or longer. Understanding this isn't about winning some invisible contest with them. It's about protecting your own peace, because once you see the pattern, it stops having power over you. Let's start with the thing most people get wrong. They think a narcissist experiences absence the way a normal person does, as loss. A normal person who loses someone they cared about feels sadness, maybe longing, maybe reflection on what could have been done differently. A narcissist doesn't process it that way because loss in the emotional sense requires a stable inner life to grieve from. What they're missing isn't a stable core, it's a mirror, and mirrors don't grieve, they just stop reflecting, and that's what makes everything so unsettling for them. Think about what a narcissist actually needs from the people around them. Not love in the way you or I would define it. What they need is confirmation. A steady stream of attention, reaction, admiration, even conflict, because all of those things tell them the same message. You matter, you're powerful, you're impossible to ignore. Psychologists sometimes call this narcissistic supply, and it's a useful phrase because it captures how transactional the whole thing is. You weren't just a partner or a friend or a family member to them. You were a source, and when you vanish completely, that source doesn't just get smaller. It disappears entirely, and there's nothing in their psychological toolkit that knows how to function without it. So here's the first thing that happens when long no contact begins. It's not sorrow, it's disorientation. Their whole operating system is built around predicting and shaping other people's reactions. They know which buttons to press, which words will make you defend yourself, which silences will make you chase them for reassurance. That's how they've navigated relationships their whole life. But no contact removes the entire feedback loop. There's no reaction to read, no argument to twist, no emotional opening to slide into. For someone whose whole sense of orientation depends on other people's responses, that's like losing a sense. They don't know where they stand anymore, and that not knowing creates a kind of internal static that they've never had to sit with before. At first, this shows up as confusion more than anger. They keep waiting for the moment where the old pattern reasserts itself. Surely you'll break first. Surely a message will come through, even a short one, even an angry one. Because in the past, every disagreement eventually produced some kind of contact. That's what made it addictive for them. The push and pull always ended in reconnection, one way or another. No contact breaks that rhythm completely, and rhythm is something the narcissistic mind relies on more than most people realize. When the expected beat doesn't come, it isn't just inconvenient. It's genuinely destabilizing. It helps to picture it almost like a radio signal cutting out mid-broadcast. For years, maybe, they've been used to a certain frequency of contact with you, whether that frequency was warm or tense or somewhere in between. Radios don't grieve when the signal drops. They just produce static, and static is uncomfortable in a very specific way. Not sad, just wrong, just unresolved. That's a decent way to think about the first days and weeks of long no contact for a narcissist. It's not sorrow settling in, it's static, and static demands to be fixed. That confusion doesn't stay confusion for long, though. It curdles into something sharper, and that something is usually anger. Not always loud anger. Sometimes it's cold and quiet, but it's there, simmering underneath. The reason anger shows up so reliably is that anger is easier to tolerate than helplessness. Helplessness is the real feeling underneath all of this. The sense that they no longer have any lever to pull, no card left to play, no way to influence what you think or feel about them. That's an unbearable position for someone whose identity depends on being the one who's in control of the emotional temperature in every relationship they're part of. So instead of sitting in that helplessness, their mind reaches for anger, because anger at least feels like doing something. It feels like power, even when there's no actual power left to wield. You might notice, if you're ever exposed to this phase indirectly, that it doesn't always look like classic rage. Sometimes it looks like contempt. Sometimes it looks like a sudden, almost theatrical indifference, the "I don't care, I never needed them anyway" performance. But underneath all of these expressions is the same engine, the fury of realizing that the story they always told themselves, the one where they're the main character and everyone else orbits around them, has hit a wall it can't push through. Once the anger has run its course, or at least once it's stabilized into something more manageable, something interesting happens. The narcissist shifts from reacting emotionally to thinking strategically. This is a distinct phase, and it's worth understanding because it explains a lot of behavior that otherwise seems baffling. Instead of asking, "How do I feel about this?" they start asking, "What will get a response?" Every idea that crosses their mind gets filtered through that single question. Should they reach out with something neutral, testing the waters? Should they let a mutual friend casually mention how well they're doing? Should they post something on social media designed to be seen? Should they wait and let the silence work on you the way it's been working on them? This calculating phase can look from the outside almost like maturity. It's quieter, it's more deliberate. But don't mistake strategy for growth. Growth would mean reflecting honestly on what went wrong and taking responsibility for their part in it. Strategy means figuring out the fastest route back to relevance. Those are two completely different processes, even though they can look superficially similar if you're not paying close attention. Now here's where things get to the real core of it, the part that explains basically everything else: ego injury. This term gets thrown around a lot, but it's worth actually unpacking what it means because it's not the same as embarrassment or disappointment. A narcissist's sense of self isn't built on a stable internal foundation the way psychologically healthy people's identities are. It's built on a performance, one that depends entirely on an audience. Charm, control, image management, the careful curation of how they're perceived, all of it exists to keep one specific feeling as far away as possible: the feeling of being insignificant, ordinary, forgettable. That feeling is intolerable to them in a way that's hard for people with more stable identities to fully grasp. When you go no contact and you actually stay gone, that protective performance starts to crack because your absence sends a message they can't argue their way out of. It says, without a single word being exchanged, that you no longer need them to define how you feel about yourself or your life. To someone whose whole identity depends on being central to other people's emotional worlds, that message reads as an attack, even though nothing aggressive actually happened. You didn't send an insult, you didn't send a single message at all, but the absence itself becomes the loudest statement you could possibly make. This is why ego injury produces such extreme reactions in some people. Some narcissists respond by lashing out, trying to claw back a sense of superiority through insults, guilt trips, or even outright smear campaigns to other people in your shared circles. Others go the opposite direction and retreat into a kind of icy contempt, telling themselves you were never worth their time to begin with, that you were beneath them, that they're relieved to be free of you. Don't mistake that coldness for genuine indifference. It's not real detachment, it's self-protection. They have to downgrade you in their own mind because the alternative, admitting that losing you actually hurt, would mean admitting a level of vulnerability their whole identity is built to avoid. And here's the cruel irony in all of this. Healthy people process rejection by reflecting on it, learning something from it, and slowly integrating it into a more complete picture of themselves. A narcissist can't do that because reflection would require acknowledging fault, and acknowledging fault threatens to collapse the entire structure they've spent years building. So instead of healing, they externalize. The story shifts. You become the cruel one. You become the unstable one. You become the reason everything fell apart. It's not because they've genuinely convinced themselves of a new reality overnight. It's a defense mechanism working in real time, rewriting the narrative just enough to keep the ego intact. It's worth pausing here to notice something that trips a lot of people up. From the outside, ego injury can look almost identical to real remorse. A narcissist who's been hit hard by long no contact might send a message that sounds thoughtful, even humble. They might say they've been doing some reflecting, that they realize they weren't perfect, that they've been in therapy or reading books or working on themselves. Sometimes that language is even borrowed accurately, word for word, from things you said to them at some point. That borrowing isn't a coincidence. It's a narcissist doing what they've always done best, which is studying what gets a reaction and reproducing it convincingly. The test isn't whether the words sound right. It's whether any of it comes with sustained, unprompted behavior change over time, with no audience and no expectation of a reward. That's the piece that's almost always missing. After the anger and the strategizing and the ego injury settle into some kind of uneasy equilibrium, a lot of narcissists move into a phase that's much harder to spot from the outside: quiet monitoring. This is the stage where it looks on the surface like they've genuinely moved on. Maybe they seem busy. Maybe they seem to be living their life without a second thought about you. But underneath that surface, there's often a persistent, low-grade surveillance happening, checking your social media more than they'd ever admit, asking mutual friends indirect questions that seem casual but are really fishing expeditions, paying close attention to any detail that filters back to them about how you're doing. The purpose of this phase isn't nostalgia, and it isn't concern for your well-being. It's information gathering. They're trying to figure out whether you're struggling or thriving, whether you seem to be doing better without them or falling apart, whether your life has quietly rearranged itself around missing them or moved on entirely. Every scrap of information gets interpreted as evidence for one big question: do I still matter to this person? If they sense that you're doing well, genuinely well, that's often more unsettling to them than if they heard you were miserable, because thriving without them is the clearest possible signal that they've become irrelevant. And irrelevance is the one outcome their whole psychology is built to avoid at all costs. This is also why a lot of narcissists wait far longer than you'd expect before making any kind of move. Reaching out too soon risks confirming the thing they're most afraid of, that you've already moved past them and their attempt at contact will simply be ignored or brushed off. So they wait, sometimes for a surprisingly long time, building a story in their head that makes the waiting feel purposeful rather than passive. They'll tell themselves you're pretending to be okay. They'll tell themselves you'll eventually cave and reach out first. These aren't objective assessments of reality. They're comforting fictions that let them preserve a sense of superiority while they sit on the sidelines watching. You can often spot this monitoring phase indirectly, even if you never see it happening in real time. Maybe an old account you hadn't thought about in months suddenly views something you posted. Maybe a friend you haven't spoken to in a while mentions almost too casually that someone was asking about you. Maybe you notice a strange spike in profile views or a follow request from an account with no real history behind it. None of these things need to be dramatic to count as monitoring. In fact, the quieter and more deniable they are, the more useful they tend to be, because deniability lets the narcissist gather information while still preserving the story that they've moved on completely and don't think about you at all. There's another quieter function to this monitoring phase too, and it has to do with image rather than emotion. By staying silent themselves, a narcissist can later claim to mutual friends or even to themselves that they were the one who chose distance. That framing matters enormously to them, especially in social circles where reputation functions as a kind of currency. Being the one who left, rather than the one who got left, protects the image they've worked so hard to maintain. If the no-contact period stretches on long enough without any cracks appearing on your end, you'll often start to see attempts to re-establish contact, but they rarely look like what you might expect. Early on, if there was ever contact right after a breakup or falling out, it tends to be raw and reactive. Pleading messages, sudden anger, dramatic gestures. But after long stretches of silence, the approach usually changes. It becomes far more calculated, far more disguised. This is often called hoovering, and the later versions of it are noticeably more sophisticated than the early ones. Instead of an emotional outburst, you might get something that looks almost mundane. A practical question about something logistical that has nothing to do with your relationship. A message that seems to have nothing to do with reconnecting at all, but somehow lands in your inbox anyway. A supposedly accidental run-in at a place they know you frequent. None of these are actually accidental or neutral. Every one of them is designed to reopen a channel without triggering an obvious red flag. The goal was never really reconciliation in any genuine sense. It's engagement. Once you respond, even coldly, even briefly, the door creaks open again. And from their perspective, a door that's even slightly open can eventually be pushed wider. Sometimes this later stage hoovering doesn't come from them directly at all. It comes filtered through other people. A mutual friend suddenly brings them up in conversation, seemingly out of nowhere. You hear, through some indirect channel, that they've been struggling, or alternatively that they're doing incredibly well and seem completely unaffected by everything. Both versions of that story are usually intentional, planted to provoke a reaction in you, whether that reaction is guilt, sympathy, jealousy, or self-doubt. Any of those emotions can be enough to crack a door that's been closed for a long time. Timing matters a great deal in this later phase too. You'll often notice that renewed contact attempts cluster around emotionally loaded moments, anniversaries, holidays, birthdays, times when you might be more likely to feel reflective or lonely. Interestingly, they're just as likely to reach out during a period when you're visibly thriving as when you're visibly struggling, because both extremes threaten their sense of relevance in different ways. Your struggle would seem to invite rescue. Your success threatens to prove they were never necessary at all. Triangulation tends to show up heavily during this phase too. That's the pattern where a third person, sometimes a new partner, sometimes an old friend of yours, sometimes even a family member, gets pulled into the picture as a tool rather than as a genuine relationship. A new partner might get paraded publicly, not necessarily because the narcissist is genuinely invested in that new connection, but because being seen with someone else generates exactly the kind of reaction they're hoping to provoke in you. If jealousy or doubt creeps back into your mind, that's a win for them, even if the new relationship itself is shallow or short-lived. Mutual friends can get pulled in the same way, fed a slightly different version of the story depending on what reaction the narcissist is trying to engineer in each direction. What makes this later, more refined version of hoovering particularly tricky is that it can genuinely mimic maturity if you're not paying close attention. The narcissist may show up calmer, more self-aware sounding, even seemingly reflective about the past. It's tempting to read that as real change, but real change comes from internal reckoning, not from external strategy. What you're actually seeing is adaptation, not growth. If the old dramatic approach didn't work, they'll try something quieter. If charm failed before, they'll experiment with a version of humility. The costume changes, but the underlying goal stays exactly the same. Regain a foothold in your emotional world, by whatever means seem most likely to succeed, given what's already failed. If none of these more refined tactics manage to get a reaction out of you either, something important starts to happen. The frustration compounds, because every unanswered attempt reinforces the exact message that no contact has been sending from the very beginning. Access has been permanently cut off. At this stage, one of two things tends to happen. Either the attempts escalate briefly into open hostility, a last flare of anger before giving up, or they collapse into a genuine, if reluctant, withdrawal. And here's the part that's genuinely useful to understand if you're the one holding the boundary. Long no contact doesn't work because it somehow changes who a narcissist is at their core. It works because it removes every single incentive for them to keep trying. There's no reward left to chase, no reaction to earn, no leverage to rebuild. Strategies that depend entirely on a response from you simply run out of oxygen when no response ever comes. When even the most persistent, most creative attempts at reconnection fail to produce anything, narcissists rarely sit with the plain truth of what happened. Sitting with a story where they were the one who got left, where they were powerless to reverse it, where they bear some responsibility for the whole collapse, is simply too threatening to their sense of self. So instead of accepting that version of events, the story gets rewritten, not necessarily through conscious, calculated lying in every case, but through a kind of psychological self-preservation. The narrative gets edited detail by detail, until the version that survives in their memory no longer threatens the identity they've spent so long protecting. You might eventually hear a version of events where you were the unstable one, the difficult one, the one who couldn't handle a real relationship. You might hear that they ended things, that they saw it coming all along, that you were never quite what they thought you were. None of that needs to be true for them to believe it, or at least to say it convincingly enough that other people believe it too. It's simply what has to happen for their internal world to stay standing. So, what does all of this actually mean for you on the other side of that silence? It means the discomfort you might feel during no contact, the waiting, the wondering whether they've moved on completely, the temptation to check in just once, isn't a sign that something's going wrong. It's often a sign that something is working exactly the way it's supposed to. The confusion, the anger, the strategizing, the monitoring, the hoovering, the eventual retreat into a rewritten story, all of it happens because your absence removed the one thing their whole psychology depended on. Not love, not connection in any mutual sense, just access. Understanding this pattern isn't about feeling triumphant over someone else's discomfort. It's about recognizing that the silence you're holding isn't cruelty, and it isn't something you need to apologize for or second guess. It's simply the removal of a system that was never built around your well-being in the first place. The version of you that stays quiet, that doesn't respond to the probing questions or the perfectly timed messages or the secondhand stories designed to provoke a reaction is the version of you that finally gets to live outside someone else's need for control. That's really the whole point of understanding this cycle. Not to predict their next move so you can brace for it anxiously, but to recognize it calmly when it shows up, label it for what it is, and keep walking in the direction of your own life. The less power their reactions have over your peace, the less any of this cycle matters at all. And that, more than anything else, is what real freedom from the whole dynamic actually looks like. It's also worth saying plainly that none of this knowledge is meant to turn you into someone who's constantly analyzing their every move from a distance, trying to decode hidden meaning behind a liked photo or a mutual friend's offhand comment. That kind of hypervigilance just keeps you tethered to them in a different way, even while you're technically not in contact. The healthier use of everything we've just walked through is almost the opposite. It's permission to stop analyzing. Once you understand that confusion, anger, calculation, ego injury, monitoring, and hoovering are simply predictable stages, rather than mysterious personal insults aimed specifically at you, you don't need to keep running the analysis every time something odd filters back to you. You already know the shape of it. You can let it happen at a distance without needing to referee it or respond to it or even think about it very much at all. There's also a common trap worth naming directly. The moment where a hoovering attempt lands right when you're at your most tired, most lonely, or most nostalgic, and it works, even briefly. That doesn't erase the progress you've made. It doesn't mean the whole no contact period was pointless or that you're back at square one. Slipping once or even responding once doesn't reset the clock on everything you've learned about the pattern. What matters far more is whether you're able to recognize what happened, understand why that particular moment made you vulnerable, and return to the boundary without spiraling into shame about the lapse. Narcissists count on shame to keep people stuck. Don't hand them that tool by turning a single slip into a reason to give up on the boundary altogether. If you take nothing else from all of this, take this. Your silence was never rejection in the way they've told themselves it was. It wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't about proving a point. It was simply the truth finally getting a chance to be louder than the performance. And the more solid that truth becomes for you personally, independent of whatever story they end up telling about it, the less any of their reactions, present or future, will have anything left to grab onto.